I'm pretty sure that's the fifth time now that I, or once Adam, walked up here to that soundtrack from the Ten Commandments, the Moses movie. But if you're new here or if you've been around, we've been going through this series through the book of Exodus. It's called The Exit and the Gospel. And the idea of the series is to try to say something like the story that happened with Moshe, or as you know him probably as Moses, the story that happened with Moshe about 3,300 or 400 years ago has an impact and relevance on your life and on my life, even here in 2022 in Mifflin County. We've been trying to ask the question of what does that story tell us now about our lives? And in order to get the whole story, it's very, very important, and I think this is one of the areas where churches struggle. Sunday message, Sunday message, Sunday message. You miss out on the big picture. So what I'd like to start off with today is a bit of a review, right? So this is the school teacher coming out of me. Where have we been so we can see where we're at and where we're going next. So here's a review of Exodus so far. Chapter 1, we started out and we realized that the Israelites were in slavery. The Israelites were in slavery to Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and what that meant is that they weren't free to do what they wanted to do. And Jesus himself reminded us that we're actually similarly in slavery. He said that everyone who sins is a slave to sin. And as a slave to sin, that means we don't actually have the freedom to live our lives in the way we want. And all slavery eventually leads to death. Not only does it lead to death physically, as we all know and experience this idea that death is in the future for us, but it also leads to the death of hope. And there's an awful lot of people in Mifflin County and throughout the world who are struggling right now with death of hope as it relates to things like depression and anxiety and stuff like that. In chapter 2 of Exodus, we sang about, if you remember when the women stood up, we sang that a deliverer was coming. And that chapter started out, and we thought that deliverer was this baby boy named Moshe, who was put into a little reed ark and floated down the Nile and was saved by Pharaoh's daughter. And the hope was that he was going to be the savior or the deliverer for the nation of Israel. But as it turned out, when Moshe got older, he did notice the problems that were happening. He did something about it. He actually killed an Egyptian overseer. But then once Pharaoh turned against him, Moshe ran about 200 or 300 miles away. And I hope for us, what that reminds us is that a mere human cannot be your deliverer. Whether that be a spouse, whether that be a parent or a child, no merely human being can handle the weight of the responsibility to be our deliverer. We need someone better than a human. And so the end of Exodus chapter 2, there's this really awesome section of verses where God says, I actually noticed the plight of Israel, and I'm ready to act because I care. And so God himself is going to be the deliverer. In chapter 3 of Exodus, God goes, he wants to act as the deliverer, and so he goes on a headhunting mission. He's looking for a partner with him to do this deliverance act, and he goes and he finds that once baby boy Moshe, who has now grown into an 80-year-old has-been, right? So that he literally spent the last 40 years or so wandering the desert with a bunch of sheep. He does not have tremendous amounts of potential. He, in fact, has some kind of speech impediment or something like that. He can't talk well. But God still meets this guy at a burning bush and says, I want you to partner with me. And the message from that Sunday was that although many of us feel inadequate to the tasks ahead of us, God looks for people who are actually inadequate so that he can work and partner with them to bring himself glory instead of the person. Last week in Exodus chapter 5, verses 1 to 21, Adam spoke about this really interesting part of the story where Moshe takes the first step of faith back into Egypt. He goes to Pharaoh, he confronts him, let my people go, and exactly the opposite of what he had hoped happens. Not only does Pharaoh not let his people go, he keeps them in slavery and he adds to their workload. He says, you got to find your own straw now. I'm not going to help you with that part of the process. And Adam reminded us that if our identity is not found in God, then when circumstances go up and down, we will vacillate exactly with those circumstances. It's only when our identity is fixed in God that we actually can deal with the ups and downs of our life. And that brings us to today. And so the place where we find Moshe at, Exodus chapter 5, verse 22, is that, just to put it super bluntly, he is discouraged, he is doubtful, and he is disappointed. He is discouraged, doubtful, and disappointed. Here's precisely what he says. He turned to the Lord and he said, "O Lord, why have you done evil to this people? Why did you ever send me? For since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done evil to this people, and you have not delivered your people at all." You have not delivered your people at all. And my guess is all of us have some sense of what it feels like to be in Moshe's sandals at this point in time. Or as Keith calls them, which I love, his Jerusalem cruisers. Some of you will get that on the way home. His Jerusalem cruisers. So whatever foot gear you have on right now, I'd like you to take a second and look at your shoes, whatever that happens to be on your current feet, even if you're a kid, whatever. And I want you to imagine the fact that in reality, whatever you're wearing, it's as if you're in Moshe's sandals, and here's why. I think it's common for all of us to have this experience that when we want to push into our faith, when we want to be obedient and do the right thing to follow God, we take that first step, and we think that once we take that step, God's going to meet us there, and everything's going to be like hunky-dory forever and ever and ever into the future. And then life kind of hits, and it doesn't work exactly that way. So for instance, and I've seen people do this, I've made this recommitment to the Lord, and now I'm going to read my Bible, and I'm going to go show up at church more, and next thing you know, wouldn't you believe that not only do their current problems not go away, their problems actually increase. Or maybe for you, you're in a relationship, whether it's a marriage or some other relationship, friendship, or family member, and you think, I know that this relationship is not all that it could be. And I want to invest in this relationship. So I'm going to bring up some area. We're going to have this serious conversation that I know I've been supposed to have for quite a while. You bring it up, you talk it through, and it turns out the conflict actually gets worse than it was before. Like, at least back then it was bad and stable, and now it's bad and catastrophic. Or maybe for you, you've been the kind of person who's kind of come to church on Sundays, you sit and you listen to the sermon, that sort of thing, but you never really got involved or engaged in the ministry of the church. And because in some, let's just say some hypothetical church, the pastor continues to bug more and more people to say, hey, we should all be involved in the ministry and the work of the church, you decide to finally take that step and say, okay, I'll do something, I'll get involved in some way of the church. You take the step, and sure enough, would you not believe that they paired you for this ministry opportunity with that one person in church? Remember, it's a hypothetical church. That one person in church who you do not particularly get along with. And you're like, God, what are you doing here? Like, I thought I was being faithful and stepping in the right direction, and not only did things not even stay the same, they actually got worse. That's the sandals that Moshe's in, and I'm pretty sure a lot of us have experienced that same feeling in whatever shoes that we're wearing. So the question in Exodus 6 is kind of like, how does God respond to Moshe in this season or the series of disappointment, discouragement, and doubt? And the first thing that God does is the first half of Exodus 6, God shows up and God basically says to Moshe, let me tell you who I am, what I've done, and what I will do. Let me explain to you again, Moshe. He did this once before at the bush that didn't burn up. He's going to come back. He's going to engage with Moshe again. He said, Moshe, listen up. I'm going to tell you who I am. Now, what I've done for the sake of kind of feeling the weight of this thing is I kind of removed a lot of the paragraphs of this, and I just want to read to you who God says he is, how God's going to interact with Moshe in sort of sentence or declarative statement sort of form. Okay, so just listen as I read and kind of feel the weight of these things. If you could go back, please, Asher. Oh, sorry. Yeah, there you go. Okay. I am the Lord. I establish my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan. I have heard the groaning of the people of Israel. I have remembered my covenant. I will deliver you from slavery to the Egyptians. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment. I will take you to be my people. I will be your God. I will bring you into the land. I am the Lord. This is the weight of the message of the promises that God is going to give to Moshe. And in a very real sense, Moshe's response to those promises is the same place that we always find ourselves. Here's why. Moshe has to ask the question in Exodus chapter 6, is what God's saying to me, are those promises empty, or are they actually going to come to pass? And every one of you lives every second of your life with that same exact question. Are those promises from God empty, or are they going to actually come to pass? Right after that, God says to Moshe, go back to Pharaoh, right? Last time you went to him, that was kind of a hot mess, but go back to Pharaoh, tell him to let my people go. And Moshe responds, and he says a really, really curious phrase. He says, basically, I can't go. Pharaoh's not going to listen to me because I have uncircumcised lips. It's like, okay, that's weird. I have uncircumcised lips. Now, if you're wondering what that means, just hold that thought. We're going to come back to it. Moshe does not go back to Pharaoh. And then Exodus chapter 6, sort of the second half of it, is a very, very odd thing shows up. So far, the entire book of Exodus has been story after story after story. And by the end of Exodus chapter 6, stuck in there is a genealogy of all things, right? And so it's just a listing of all these names. And if you know Bible genealogies, basically what that means, if you're reading along, is something like, I don't know how to pronounce this name, and I don't know how to pronounce this name, and I don't know how to, right? Like that's the progression that we see into that genealogy. And so the question is, why on earth is there a genealogy at the end of Exodus chapter 6? Why is Moshe's disappointment and discouragement confronted with a genealogy? And the answer, I think, is something like this. What God is saying is that I'm writing a really big story here. Like, I have a bigger plan than just you, and I met with Abraham, and I said that this family is going to turn into a nation that's going to be blessed to be a blessing. Like, that's my plan. And the genealogy is interesting because it goes through a couple of Israel or Jacob's sons, and then when it gets to Levi, the Levites, it goes down through, and it clearly comes to Aaron and to Moshe. And what I think God's doing is he's reminding them and saying, you're part of something. You're part of a story that is much bigger than you are. And so I'm meeting you in this moment of discouragement and disillusionment and doubt, and you're actually part of something that's entirely bigger than what you can see from where you're at right now, from the circumstances that seem obvious around you. After the genealogy, we again come to the same fascinating interaction because God goes to Moshe and says, hey, go back to Pharaoh and tell him to let my people go. And Moshe again responds something like, Pharaoh won't listen to me. I have uncircumcised lips. It's like, why does Moshe keep talking about this uncircumcised lip situation? And there's a lot of discussion over what exactly he meant by that. Like, what is an uncircumcised lip? I mean, it's an odd thing. And some folks would say that there's a line of thought that some folks think that Moshe literally had some kind of growth on his face, and that there was like a physical deformity going on there, and that's why he said that. There's another line of thought that most people, a lot of people agree to, that there's some kind of speech impediment or some struggle with verbalizing language that Moshe had. There's a third line of thought that talks about this idea that when Moshe says, I have uncircumcised lips, what he's basically getting at is this idea that his lips were not, his ability to communicate did not carry like the holy and powerful weight of God's voice. In other words, his communication was not spiritually powerful enough to achieve the work that God wanted to achieve. And so basically, regardless of kind of how you interpret any of those three things, what we know for sure is that Moshe continued to be inadequate to the task in front of him. And I hope you've been getting the sense of this, because I feel like this is like the third week now in a row almost, where the message is Moshe is inadequate to the task in front of him. And I hope in some ways that's freeing or like helpful to you, because you might feel inadequate to the task in front of you, sort of like I often feel. But it's precisely in this space, and you have to get this, because one of our giant problems with reading the Bible is that we almost tend to always be able to read it from this side of the story and how it went. So what we can't get is we can't get what it felt like to be precisely in Moshe's sandals and to literally not know what's going to happen next. Like, he already confronted Pharaoh once, and it went really bad. He doesn't know, like he knows the promises of God, but technically speaking, he can't control his pathway into this unknown future. And what that means is I think it can be really, really helpful for all of us in 2022 in Mifflin County, because guaranteed, like, I love y'all. Nobody in this room, and as I've said before, PD didn't give me his pastor's crystal ball, so this includes me. Like, nobody in this room can see with 100% certainty our path into an unknown future. Like, we don't know what's going to happen next. Moshe didn't know what's going to happen next, and neither do you, and neither do I. And so the question becomes, how do we walk forward? How do you, again, think about your shoes. How do you take your shoes and step them into the unknown and uncertain future? And what do you base how you're going to act in the future upon? And as I see it, we have two options. Here's your two options. Option number one, you can look at the circumstances around you. You can say, this is the situation that I'm within in this world, and based on these circumstances, I'm going to make decisions into my future that are going to be kind of best for me, decisions that are going to be most comfortable, right? The easiest decisions, the most, beneficial decisions for me and my people. Or what you can do is you can say, here's the circumstances, but also here are the promises of God. Here is the way that he has revealed himself in history, right? Just like Moshe is looking back and saying, here's how God revealed himself to me in the burning bush. Here's how God revealed himself to me in this communication, in this genealogy. We have the option to look back and say, here's how God has revealed himself. And however he revealed himself, I'm going to walk forward with faith that those promises are going to come into reality. And it's at this point that I want to talk about this interesting or confusing word faith, because my sense is this. I could be wrong, as always. I'm probably wrong a large percent of the time, but I feel like we chuck around the word faith all the time in Christian or religious circles, right? You got to have faith, right? Oh, we'll just have faith in that. Oh, do you believe in God? Do you have faith? Something like that. We throw the word around a lot. But I'm not convinced that we really think through what actually does it mean to live a life that has faith in God. Because at some level, what that has to mean is something like we are going to walk into this uncertain or unknown future, not based primarily on our circumstances, but based on the promises and the truths revealed from God in Jesus and through the scriptures. And it's not obvious. It's not obvious that we always do that. It's not abundantly clear to me that when we think of our faith, we're thinking in those kinds of ways. Now, let me give a little aside or a little reminder or correction to that. Here's what I'm not saying. I am not saying today that you just blindly accept everything, don't have to think at all, don't use your brain, don't use your intellect. All you have to do is just have faith and step forward in faith like someone who doesn't know what they're doing. I'm not saying that at all. I believe very confidently that God gave you a brain, God gave us intellect, God gave us thoughtfulness, and I would argue that the best path forward for you is to think through as much, the word is wrestle, to wrestle through as much as you possibly can your best understanding of who God is. And what that means is that if you're like Moshe, who had discouragement and doubt and confusion, you go to God and you say, God, I don't understand this. Like, you haven't even delivered your people at all. Like, what's going on here? And you wrestle with, is the Bible true? And you wrestle with, how was this whole thing created, right? And you wrestle with all the things that we need to actually wrestle with. So faith is not opposed to reason, but the problem with reason is that reason can only take you so far. Like, you can think your way, everybody, no matter what their view of the world, can think their way up so far. And then there has to come a point where you say, the future is uncertain. What am I going to choose to base how I step into that future on? I can choose to base it on purely my circumstances, or I can base it on the promises of God. When I was a kid, there's a bunch of kids around here today. When I was a kid, I was very odd. It's funny because there's like, who feels comfortable to laugh at me when I say that? You can, yeah, you can. I was very odd when I was a kid, and so one of the things I tried to do a lot is I would try to read the Bible, and I figured the New Testament is what people talked about more in church, so let me start with the New Testament, and I'd open up to the New Testament, and you get to Matthew chapter 1, and does anyone know what you find in Matthew chapter 1? First thing is this whole chapter of a big, long genealogy. More names that you have no idea how to pronounce after names, and I'm just like, I don't know what I'm doing here. Like, here's all these crazy names. What's going on? And what struck me recently is that genealogy, if not for Moshe's step of faith, as we're going to see next week in Exodus chapter 7, where he actually does confront Pharaoh, kind of based on God's promises, he goes into Pharaoh. If not for that, God would not. He might have used some other method, but that's the way he did choose to use to save Israel out of Egypt. And if not for that, Israel wouldn't be in the promised land. And if they weren't in the promised land, then that genealogy would not have happened, and that genealogy wouldn't have ended with a person that we know of as Jesus. And what's interesting about Jesus is that he lived his life in complete faithfulness to the Father. Right? So he says, like, I and the Father are one. Like, there was a sense, you can read it at the end of the book of John, the sense that Jesus kind of had this, like, download from the Father. The Father communicated to Jesus what to do, and Jesus just stepped forward in faith every single time. Right? Like, faith that he could heal, faith that, all these things would come to pass. And then by the end of Jesus' life, there's this really fascinating situation, right? You guys all know the story, because he's in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he's about to go to the cross, and he's going to carry his own cross to his certain death. And one of the fascinating questions that Jesus had to have at that moment is something like, what does it look like for me to have faith that going towards death is actually going to end up in some way good? Or like, how is there going to be hope that's going to go past my physical death towards something that actually has eternal, good, God-given hope? And so he goes there and he dies, and then that looks like the hope is crushed, right? Just like Pharaoh's desire to kill off the nation of Israel looks like the hope is crushed. But then kind of out of that death, Jesus is resurrected and springs this new life. And Paul, who's super, super brilliant, he says in 1 Corinthians 15, this really awesome passage, he talks about how if Jesus didn't rise again, then anybody who put their hope in like the Christian faith would be unintelligent, right? Because why would you hope in something if death ended it and new life didn't come out on the other side? But if Jesus was resurrected, then it seems to Paul, and it should seem to us maybe, that when we're facing the uncertain future, we can put our faith that God's promises are going to come to pass. That like death, I think it says in that passage, that death is swallowed up in victory, right? That's not the ultimate thing. And so when we think about going forward, the question is something like, how does this apply to you? Or like, what do you do? Or why does this matter to you? So again, I would say that we all got our version of our Jerusalem cruisers on. And wherever you're sitting today, you're staring at some level at an uncertain future. You cannot, right? Like there could be catastrophe. Like you don't know what's going to happen next. You just don't know. And the question I want us to ask together is the best way to step into that uncertain future to do it based on just our circumstances and what seems easiest and most comfortable? Or what does it look like to step into that uncertain future based on the promises that we received from God? I'll kind of end with this. There's a really interesting saying at the end, or in I think it's chapter 2 of the book of James. The author says that faith without works is dead. And I think a lot of Christian people, there's a lot of discussion at some point in time, like, should the book of James be in the Bible or not? Because people wrestled with this idea, faith without works is dead. Does that mean, like, we just have to earn our salvation, right? Like, we just have to do a certain amount of stuff so that we get... But I don't think that's what it's getting at. I think what it's getting at is this. If you are not stepping into an uncertain future at some level based on God's promises, there's going to have to be some kind of work that's displayed there. Because, like, how else are you going to go into the future? If you go into the future only based on the circumstances and what's easiest for you, that kind of thing, there's going to be no work. And by work, I mean something like this. If God's promises are true, that means you can step into that uncertain future and forgive somebody around you, right? Because you don't have to hold on to that wrong that they did because God didn't hold on to the wrong that you did. Or if you're stepping into that uncertain future, you might have to confront or create conflict with somebody around you because your trust is in the promises of God, even if they don't see it that same sort of way. And so as I think about our church going into 2022, 2023, and beyond, my hope for us is that not that we show works to earn God's favor, but that we're so excited by the promises and big story that God is writing, that excitement moves us to step forward. And I think, for me, I'm seeing it places. Like, it gets very, very exciting when I see individuals and people who are saying, I'm going to devote my time and energy to this thing, even though that's not actually easiest and best for me, because of God's promises. That's super, super exciting. So let me pray for y'all. We're going to get up here and we're going to sing some songs, hopefully in response to that message, that talk about what it looks like to trust in God's promises and to go forward in faith. But let me pray first. Heavenly Father, I pray for these folks here. I think especially of the kids who are upstairs right now, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. However old they are, I think about how these children, we literally cannot gauge what the future of this world is going to look like. Again, we have another election coming up. Everybody's going to say, basically, everyone's causing this world to go to hell. And the question becomes, how do we, as followers of Jesus, put our confidence not in our circumstances, not in what's just best for us or easiest for us, but our confidence in the promises of your story, and especially in Jesus, who ultimately showed that love looks like laying down his life for the good of others. So I pray, Lord, that you'd encourage us as a church to go forward in a similar way, to bring much glory to you. I pray for these folks, Lord, especially the parents of the young kids, that we could kind of enculture this message of the glory of the gospel around them, to embolden them as they face this world as well. Pray, Lord, that you'd bless these people. I love them. I thank you for them. I pray for goodness and for your glory to come through our lives. In Jesus' name, amen.